Hi, welcome to Minute with Mickey, a time for us to wonder about the story we find in 1 Kings chapter 20 that we've titled The Wounded Prophet. This is a very interesting story, and I would highly recommend that you go back into the text because hearing it made me want to go back in and look for these details. One is, I wondered again, what kind of character is Ahab as the king? He was an awful king, but how ridiculous is it that he'd be so willing to give up all of his gold, all of his silver, his wives, and his sons without even checking with his advisors in terms of what to do about this threat from Syria. It's not until Syria makes the next threat that he goes to his advisors and then they say, no, we need to fight him. Then when the prophet comes to Ahab, we know it's not Elijah. Elijah's gone off to do something else at the time, but there are obviously other prophets. So I'd like to know more about these prophets. Where did they come from? Where are they? Who are they? Do we have any other names? But this prophet comes and tells Ahab that he is going to have the victory. And I think it'd be very interesting for us to take a look at what the text tells us about, even though Israel's army is so small, that God is going to give Israel the victory over Syria and over Ben-Hadad in order to prove a point to someone specific, to a particular country. Who is it? Usually we see that God says, I'm going to give you the victory so that the opposing army knows who is the true God. Is that what happens this time? Is that the reason for the victories this time? Then we have the idea of there must be gods of mountains and gods of plains, of flatlands. And this is what Syria believes. They have all kinds of different gods, and we know that our God never wanted to be considered one of those kinds. And so that's why there's this indication later on when Syria decides after the first defeat to come back later in the spring to try to defeat them again, but this time on the flat land. And the Lord says to the prophet to tell Ahab, because they said that you only won because they fought against the God of the mountain, and they're going to try to defeat the God of the God of the plains they can win on, I am going to give you victory again, so that, and then I want you to go back in the text and look, so that who knows that God is the only God? We also have a question here about the fact that when you fight in this kind of war, God intended for Ahab to annihilate the entire army that they were fighting against. They were supposed to. God gave the entire army into their hands. And yet Ahab, in his own self-centeredness maybe, decided that he could make some kind of a deal with Ben-Hadad. And that did not turn out well at all. And that's when we have this little discussion about the wounded prophet, where the prophet is told by God that he should wound himself by having someone do that to him. Did anybody see any kind of connection to a lion eating someone who disobeyed God? We'd seen that before, not too many stories ago. So there's a theme there, and I found that interesting. But when the prophet goes in bandages and shows up and says what he says to Ahab, Ahab pronounces his own judgment. And it does turn out to come to him. I almost pictured like in a film where the prophet who's all bandaged up would have just ripped off his bandages and said, aha, it will be to you as you have said it was supposed to be for me. But I did wonder, why did the prophet have to be literally, physically beaten up? Couldn't he have just pretended that? After all, he said a pretend story. Couldn't he have just pretended about the beating? What was significant about having that real bruising and that real beating taken place? And what is it that God is saying here about when I tell you to do something, you better obey? Those are the things I wondered about. Go back into the text, take a look at it, and see what it is that God is saying to you. Have a great week.